Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. In this video, let's discuss the complete set of Playwright interview questions along with answers. Okay, so guys, I have already covered the JavaScript in previous video. So please do check out and let's get started with the video without wasting any time. Okay, initially let's discuss the concepts about Playwright fundamentals, starting from what is Playwright and why was it created. Okay, so Playwright is an open source end-to-end automation testing framework developed by Microsoft for automating modern web applications across multiple browsers using a single API. It supports Chromium, Firefox, and WebKit. Okay, Playwright enables testers and developers to perform UI testing, API testing, cross-browser testing, mobile emulation, visual testing, and end-to-end testing efficiently. Okay, so companies prefer Playwright because it's faster than traditional Selenium setups and less flaky tests, better support for modern web applications, powerful debugging capabilities, and it has built-in test runner, easy CI/CD integration, strong TypeScript and JavaScript support from the community. Okay, so and the second question is about how is Playwright different from Selenium? Okay, so Playwright and Selenium both are popular automation tools used for testing web applications, but Playwright was designed to address many of the challenges faced with traditional browser automation. Okay, so the major differences are in architecture, speed, synchronization, browser support, execution model, and modern web application handling. Selenium communicates with browsers through the WebDriver protocol, whereas Playwright communicates directly with the browser engines using native browser protocols. Because of this, Playwright generally provides faster execution, better reliability, and reduced test flakiness than Selenium. Playwright also comes with built-in features such as auto-waiting, network interception, API testing, trace viewer, screenshots, videos, and browser context isolation. While Selenium often requires additional libraries or framework implementations for these capabilities. For modern applications built with React, Angular, and Vue, Playwright usually requires less synchronization code and provides a more stable automation experience. Okay, so in the next topic, the interview question is about how is Playwright different from Cypress? Okay, it's a simple guys. Playwright and Cypress are both our modern web automation frameworks, but they differ significantly in architecture, browser support, multi-tab handling, parallel execution, API capabilities, and overall flexibility. Cypress runs inside the browser and executes command directly within the browser context, whereas Playwright communicates externally with browser engines using native browser protocols. Because of this architecture, Playwright can handle multiple tabs, multiple browser contexts, multiple users, and cross-browser testing more effectively. Playwright supports Chromium, Firefox, and WebKit with a single API, while Cypress was initially focused on Chromium-based browsers and added broader browser support later. Playwright also provides built-in features such as browser context isolation, API testing, network interception, tracing, video recording, and mobile emulation. For enterprise-level automation frameworks, multi-user workflows, cross-browser testing, and complex end-to-end scenarios, Playwright is generally considered more powerful and scalable. Okay, so yeah, let's discuss the set of next interview questions under Playwright fundamentals. Okay, so what are the key advantages of Playwright over traditional automation tools? Which browsers are supported by Playwright? How does Playwright communicate with browsers internally? What is the architecture of Playwright? Explain the Playwright execution flow from test execution to browser interaction. Why is Playwright considered faster than Selenium? What programming languages are supported by Playwright? And what is Playwright test runner? What are Playwright fixtures? What are browser context and page objects in Playwright? Explain the relationship between browser context and page. What are the prerequisites for setting up the Playwright? How do you install Playwright in new project? What is the purpose of playwright.config.js or playwright.config.ts? How does Playwright manage browser binaries? How do you run a Playwright test from a command line? How do you execute a specific test file in Playwright? Okay, so the next set of interview questions are about browser management. Okay, so how do you launch Chromium browsers in Playwright? How do you launch Firefox browser in Playwright? How do you launch WebKit browser in Playwright? What is a headless mode and why it is used? What is a headed mode and when should be used? How do you launch a browser in incognito mode using Playwright? What is browser context and why it is important? How do you create multiple browser contexts? How do you simulate multiple users using browser contexts? What is persistent browser context? How do you reuse authentication across test executions? How do you store browser state in Playwright? What is storage state.json and how it is used? How is it used? How do you launch browsers with custom arguments? How do you emulate browser permissions? How do you clear cookies in Playwright? How do you manage sessions in Playwright? How do you open multiple tabs in Playwright? How do you switch between the tabs in Playwright? How do you handle browser crashes gracefully? Okay, and the next set of interview questions are with respect to the locators. So let's get started. Okay, so what is a locator in Playwright? What are locators? Why are locators preferred over element handle? What is auto waiting in locators? What is the difference between locator and element handle? How do you locate elements using ID? How do you locate elements using CSS locators? How do you locate elements using XPath and using text selectors and using role selectors? Okay, why are role based locators recommended? How do you locate elements using placeholder text? How do you locate elements using labeled text? How do you locate elements using alt text, title attributes? And how do you chain locators in Playwright? How do you locate parent elements and child elements? How do you locate sibling elements? How do you handle dynamic locators? How do you create a reusable locator methods? How do you use nth locator, first locator and last locator? How do you filter locators? How do you combine multiple locators? How do you locate indent elements? And how do you locate elements inside the shadow DOM? How do you locate React components and Angular components and Vue components? How do you identify flaky locators? How do you design stable locators? How do you handle frequently changing DOM structures? How do you handle dynamically generated IDs? What locator strategy would you choose in a large enterprise application and why? How would you create a locator utility library? How would you identify locator performance issues? What are the locator anti-patterns? What happens internally when locator.click is executed? Explain Playwright strict mode and locator resolution. Okay, and the next set of interview questions are with respect to the actions and user interactions. Okay, so let's start. How do you perform click actions in Playwright? How do you perform double click actions? How do you perform right click actions? How do you fill text fields? How do you clear input fields? How do you press keyboard keys? How do you upload files, download files, and how do you drag and drop elements? How do you hover over elements? How do you select drop down values? How do you handle multi-select drop downs? How do you work with checkboxes? How do you work with radio buttons? How do you handle date pickers? How do you handle sliders? How do you handle and perform mouse operations? How do you simulate keyboard shortcuts? And how do you interact with hidden elements? How do you interact with disabled elements? Okay, and the next set of interview questions are based on assertions in Playwright. Okay, so what are assertions? What is the difference between hard assertions and soft assertions? How does expect work internally? What assertions are commonly used in Playwright? How do you verify element visibility? How do you verify text content? How do you verify attribute values? How do you verify CSS properties? And how do you verify API response data? How do you create custom assertions? And the next set of interview questions are with respect to weights and synchronization. How does Playwright auto weighting work internally? What conditions are checked before Playwright performs a click action? What is the difference between auto weighting and explicit weighting? Why should page.wait for timeout method should be avoided? What are the different wait strategies available in Playwright? How do you wait for an element to become visible? How do you wait for network requests? How do you wait for API responses? How do you handle long running backend operations? How do you implement custom polling mechanisms? Okay. And the next set of interview questions are with respect to the frames, windows and tabs. Okay, let's start discussing what are iframes and how do you handle them in Playwright. What is a frame locator and why was it introduced? How do you switch between the frames? How do you interact with nested frames? How do you handle multiple tabs? How do you handle multiple browser windows? How do you validate a pop-up window? How do you handle window.open method scenarios? How do you synchronize between parent and child windows? What challenges arise when handling multiple tabs in parallel execution? Okay, and the next set of interview questions are with respect to the API testing with Playwright. Okay, so how does Playwright support API testing? What is API request context? How do you perform get requests, post requests, put requests, patch requests and delete requests? And how do you validate response status code? How do you validate response headers, response schema? And how do you implement token based authentication? How do you handle OAuth authentication? How do you create reusable API clients? How do you perform API chaining? How do you integrate API and UI validation in a single Playwright test? Okay, and the next set of interview questions are with respect to the Playwright framework designing part. So explain the automation framework you designed using the Playwright. How would you design a Playwright framework from scratch? What folder structure would you follow for a large scale Playwright framework? How would you implement the page object model in Playwright? What are the drawbacks of traditional page object model? How would you implement page factory concepts in Playwright? How would you create reusable utilities? How do you manage environment configurations? How do you implement logging and reporting? How do you integrate Allure reports or extend reports? How do you design a data-driven framework or a keyword-driven framework or a hybrid framework? How do you manage test data centrally? How do you implement dependency injection? How do you implement parallel execution? How do you optimize execution time? How do you design a framework for 10,000 plus test cases? Okay. So, and the next set of interview questions are advanced level Playwright interview questions. Okay. Explain the Playwright's internal architecture. How does Playwright communicate with browser engines? How does Playwright handle browser isolation? What is browser context isolation? How does Playwright prevent test interference? How does Playwright support parallel execution internally? How does Playwright implement auto waiting internally? How does Playwright handle retries internally? What is Playwright tracing and how does it work internally? How does Playwright generate screenshots and videos? How does Playwright manage network interception? How does root.fulfill method work internally? Root.continue method work internally? And how does root.abort method work internally? Okay. And how do you debug memory leaks in Playwright? How would you profile show slow running Playwright suites? And how would you optimize Playwright execution in CI/CD? How do you execute Playwright in Docker? And how do you execute Playwright in Kubernetes? How do you run Playwright tests in Selenium grid-like environment? Okay, these are the collated questions, guys, and grouped interview questions. And the next set of interview questions are with respect to the scenario-based Playwright related questions. So let's get started. A button becomes visible only after 3 API calls. complete. How would you automate this scenario? A page loads dynamically through WebSockets. How would you validate the data? An application uses Shadow DOM extensively. How would you design your automation approach? Your tests are flaky only in CI/CD and never locally. How would you investigate? A login token expires every 15 minutes. How would you design your framework? Your application contains 50 plus nested iframes. How would you handle it? How would you automate a multi-user workflow involving 3 users simultaneously? How would you automate a real-time chat application? How would you validate millions of records returned through paginated APIs? How would you reduce execution time from 8 hours to 1 hour? Okay, and the next set of interview questions are with respect to the AI powered Playwright automation. Okay, so here, how can Gen AI improve the Playwright automation? How would you integrate an LLM with Playwright? How would you use AI to generate Playwright test cases automatically? How would you use AI to generate locators dynamically? How would you use AI to self-heal broken locators? How would you validate AI generated test cases? What risks are involved in AI generated automation scripts? How would you create an AI powered automation framework? How would you automate exploratory testing using AI agents? How would you integrate open AI APIs with Playwright? How would you use AI for visual testing? And how would you use AI for root cause analysis for failed tests? How would AI assist in test maintenance? How would you design a self-healing Playwright framework? How would you build an autonomous testing agent using Playwright? Okay, and the next set of interview questions are with respect to the MCP, Model Context Protocol, and AI agent testing. Okay, so let's get started. What is Model Context Protocol? Why was MCP introduced? How does MCP differ from traditional API integrations? What are MCP servers and what are MCP clients? How does Playwright integrate with MCP servers? How would you automate MCP enabled applications? How would you validate responses from an MCP server? How would you test tool invocation workflows in MCP? How would you test context sharing between AI agents using MCP? How would you validate agent memory persistence? How would you automate multi-agent collaboration scenarios? How would you test AI agent tool permissions? How would you test prompt injection vulnerabilities in MCP applications? How would you design a Playwright framework for AI for testing AI agents? How would you validate hallucination prevention mechanisms? How would you test retrieval augmented generation RAG systems using Playwright? And how would you automate evaluation of AI generated responses? How would you test an AI copilot integrated into a web application? How would you build an end-to-end AI testing framework using Playwright and MCP? Okay, so these are the complete set of grouped interview questions. I have given answers for all these questions in the interview preparation kit. Please do check out and let me know if you have any queries or questions. It has been designed for complete 0 to 15 plus years of experienced candidate, and it has been crafted after 3500 plus real automation interviews, and it covers the actual questions asked in almost all the organizations, including service-based, product-based, startups and mid-sized companies. Okay, so please do check out for the link in the description and also in the comment section, and let me know if you have any queries or questions through comment box or drop me an email. Thank you so much for watching my video. All the best for your upcoming interview. Happy learning, happy testing.